Okay, our first speaker this morning is Giulio Zanella from the University of Adelaide, and he'll be talking about prison work and recidivism. So please give him a round of applause.
All right, good morning everyone, and thanks for putting together this terrific conference. So today I will talk about prison work as a pathway to the rehabilitation of convicts. And by prison work, I mean labor services provided by prisoners during an incarceration term. Now, this is Australia, former largest penal colony in the world, so this is a topic that is probably in the DNA of many Australians. Although today I will talk about Italy. Right, so more than 60 years ago, the United Nations defined standards for prison work. And according to these principles, all able convicts should be required to work for pay, so should not be free, in useful, non-afflictive occupations. So you cannot have just people breaking rocks for punitive purposes, preferably in full-time jobs created by the prison administration. And this principle, they reflected a threefold rationale. So first of all, avoiding idleness and inactivity. So there's plenty of evidence that spending long hours in a cell without doing nothing makes things worse. So it's a criminogenic effect. Second, earning money for self-independence. So if you earn money during an incarceration term, you can send the money back, you can support your family, and so when you go back home, you don't find like a devastated or broken family. And third, develop, probably this is the most important purpose in the intentions of who designed this principle, to develop work habits and skills for a normal post-release life. So these are the principles. The reality is quite different. So in fact, in most advanced countries, there is severe rationing of work opportunities for convicts. And this is primarily due to the fact that if you have to pay convicts, these programs are expensive. And so these funds for prison work programs are scarce. And overcrowding of prisons just makes things worse. So the consequence is that many convicts end up spending long hours in their cell. In Italy, for instance, I will have more to say about the institutional setting, but work programs are compulsory, so convicts are required to work, and yet at the end of 2017, the participation rate was just 30%. So just 1 in 3 eligible convicts were in fact working. At an hourly wage of €3.50, roughly, which, by the way, is not bad. I'll have more to say about this. And in Italy, the incarceration rate is quite high, 70%. And this is the most dreadful statistic to me. The average number of hours of time out of cells in Italy is 4 hours. So these convicts spend 20 hours in their cell or unit. I've also put together some comparable statistics for Australia from various sources. So this may be wrong. You know much more than me about this. First of all, I'm not sure that these work programs are compulsory in Australia as well. But anyway, in Australia, the participation rate is quite high. I think it's around 80% of all eligible inmates last year. The hourly wage, I have had a hard time finding this data, but I kind of reckon that should be something around $1.20, so quite low. That's comparable to the low rates that prisoners are paid, for instance, in the United States. It's actually higher than in the United States. In the United States, they literally work for a few cents an hour. The incarceration rate in Australia, I think a 2-year incarceration rate is about 45%. And Australian convicts do a little better than in Italy. Average number of hours of time out of cells is 10, so more than twice than in Italy. So the situation seems brighter in Australia, but there are some signals of warning. For instance, this is news from last year from ABC News, and it was this about the successful prison work programs to be closed due to budget cuts, with devastating results, warns former boss. Now, of course, the most devastating result for the boss was that he would have lost his job, which is why he was complaining. But still, if these programs work, it's not a good idea to scale them down. So we want to know whether they work. Again, unfortunately today I don't have much to say about Australia, but I'll show you whether they work in Italy. And by the way, if you would like to engage on these topics like evaluation of prison work program, I'd be delighted to, using your fantastic Australian data where no one is forgiven. So the question I'm going to ask is, does substituting idle time in a cell with active time at work reduce reincarceration? Okay, that's the question I want to answer. The institutional setting, as I said, will be the Italian prison labor system, and I will use administrative data from the Italian Department of Prison Administration. So these are great data because it's really the universe of all convicts released over a 5 years window. I'll show you the data in a few minutes. And I will perform a twofold empirical analysis. So the econometric strategy here is to combine reduced form, as we call them in econometrics, and structural methods. So the reduced form methods will use a quasi-experimental strategy to provide a credible identification of a causal effect, right? Like pretty much like Anne has argued this morning. Moreover, I will also engage in structural estimation, which offers the advantage of being able to pinning down and decomposing the underlying mechanisms in a kind of transparent and hopefully convincing way. So these causal mechanisms is what yesterday were called these change levers. So why do these programs work? Okay, that's the question. Let me give you right away the answer, because before going into the details. So the answer is that paid employment, I should have emphasized paid as well. So paid employment in unskilled prison jobs, which is what I will analyze today, contribute substantially to the rehabilitation of convicts. And the quantitative result is that in the specific context that I'm analyzing, if we increase annual hours, average annual hours spent at work by 1 standard deviation, which means 240 hours per year. So increase by 240 hours per year the time spent at work by these convicts in every year in their prison term, then this leads to a reduction of their incarceration rate of, by 10 percentage points 1 year of release, off a base rate, reincarceration rate of about 18%, so you would cut that in half, and about 15 percentage points 3 years of release. So this is a persistent effect, and so the pattern is that in the Italian context, basically having these convicts working more, 1 standard deviation would cut in half the reincarceration rate of these individuals. So this is a big effect. And I will show you a simple back of the envelope calculation that shows that these effects translate into a rate of return on funds allocated to these programs of about 40%. That means if the government puts $1 extra in these programs, the government gets back $1.40 through a lower cost of the criminal justice system. So you economize basically on the cost of incarceration. That's a pretty good rate of return on an investment. So at least in the Italian context, money spent in these programs seems to be, but public funds seems to be pretty well spent. Now going down to the mechanisms, why what is driving these results. So my structural decomposition shows that 1/3 of this effect is accounted for by what I call the liquidity effect. So the liquidity effect means that you are earning money. The money is put aside in an account. It can be spent to buy some like consumption items. Typically in Italy they would buy food, because food in Italian prisons is terrible, as you would guess. But also the money can be sent home. And when you're released, you have a liquidity buffer, so they give you money. You have money in your pocket. You get out and you have some money. You don't need to steal right away the very same day. So liquidity effect is 1/3. So it's important that these work programs come with the salary. However, the bulk of this effect, in my preferred econometric specification, is given, so 2/3 of the effect come from what I call the training effect. So the training effect comes from the fact that by working in prison, so prison work counterbalances the kind of negative impact of incarceration on human capital and labor market skills. So by spending idle time in prison, essentially, I argue that worsens the mental health of prisoners, so it decreases your ability to earn money and your ability to get a job when you get out. By working instead, you kind of keep up with the habit of working itself and the ability, you learn some useful skills, but these are unskilled jobs, the one I'm talking about. Things like cleaning, doing the laundry, this sort of thing. So they're not very skilled, and yet they essentially argue that they support the mental health of prisoners. Yeah, so that's the structural decomposition. There is a third channel that I consider, which I call the criminal capital effect, which essentially consists of decreased social interactions in prison with other criminals. So by working, instead of staying in a locked cell talking to other criminals, you basically reduce the rate of accumulation of criminal capital in prison. But that channel, according to my estimate, seems to be the least relevant. Okay, so that's the overview in case I don't make it to the end. Let me now dig into the details. So institutional background, in Italy, prison labor is regulated by the Italian Prison Code, which has 3 key provisions. The first is that work is compulsory for convicts, as I said, and there are 2 types of jobs available. The vast majority, 90%, are what I call prison jobs. These are mostly unskilled jobs offered by the Department of Prison Administration, and they essentially consist of small jobs for prison functioning and upkeeping, plus small manufacturing activity, but the vast majority are like these things that we see in the movies, like cleaning, doing the laundry, cooking, delivering the mail, and so on. And all convicts are eligible for these jobs. 10% instead are external jobs. They're more skilled. They're offered by external private employers. And as you can imagine, these convicts that get these jobs are highly selected. So only a small majority, only a small fraction, in fact, are eligible. The second principle is that prison work is not punitive and convicts must be paid a fair wage. And the law in Italy establishes a wage floor. So these wages must not be below 2/3 of the national going wage, which is the wage agreed upon by during the collective bargaining between the government and the unions, essentially. And the third provision is that providing work opportunities to convicts is also compulsory on the side of the prison administration. In reality, however, prison work is heavily rationed. I don't know if someone can click on that button. Did it touch screen? No. Could you please click on that rationing button? No. Yeah, you see this? It's something you can click on. Yeah, thank you. So there's a time series that tells you the extent of the rationing. So the blue series is prison jobs per convicts. You read that on the left scale. You see that only basically 25% of convicts get a job over time. There's some fluctuation, and the fluctuation, as you see, reflects the gray series. That's the right scale. It's millions of euros. That's how much money the government, the Minister of Justice, puts into this work program every year. You see that when the government puts less money, like during the financial crisis, during the slash of the Italian budget, when the money goes down, the number of jobs also go down. When the government puts more money here, then convicts get more jobs. But you see there's a lot of rationing. If you can go back on this return. Yeah, thank you. How is this, what is the rationing mechanism? Essentially, prison wardens resort to work sharing. Work sharing means the following, that the mechanism has two components. Okay, I call them the discretionary de facto component and the deterministic de jure component. The discretionary component is due to the fact that, so reflects the fact that prison wardens can decide who gets a job and who doesn't. So here's an example. I have been talking to some of these prison wardens. An example is, one of them told me, you see, if there is a convict that is a drug addict, I am supposed to have this person working, but I cannot assign this person to, for instance, cleaning, because this person would have access to the infirmary and so drugs. So in that case, the prison warden just says, okay, I am supposed to give you a job, but no. Okay? The prison wardens can do that. So the key implication here is that prison work, even in this unskilled job, reflect unobservable characteristics. That's the endogeneity problem, the self-selection problem that Anna was talking about this morning. So that's a problem for the econometric analysis, because these job allocations would not be randomly assigned. So we will be unable to identify a causal effect of working in prison on subsequent rehabilitation and recidivism. So to overcome this problem, fortunately, there's a second component, which is a deterministic or de jure component. So the Italian prison code essentially dictates that the assignment order to these jobs must reflect the duration of the unemployment spell. So here, this provision provides a nice quasi-experiment, right? Because if I and Don entered the same prison for the same conviction in 2 consecutive days, if I entered 1 day earlier, I will have a systematic advantage on Don in assignment to prison work throughout the incarceration spell. And so I will work more in this rotation, in this work rotation process. So that's the intuition, and these deterministic components technically provides an instrumental variable for prison work. So I will skip on all the technical details from the model and the econometrics. Let me just give you an idea of what the underlying, in 2 minutes, what the underlying theoretical structure is. So essentially, the timing of the interaction here is the following. Here is the sequence. So prison wardens, they decide prison work allocation. So all my convicts in my prison, I decide who works and for how long. These allocations operate, so do something to convicts through 3, what I call them, technologies. These are the 3 mechanisms I have mentioned at the beginning. Okay, they provide you with liquidity, they provide you with some skills and mental health, and then they reduce your criminal capital because you stay out of cell. In turn, these 3 technologies determine whether after the incarceration, the former inmate engages in crime again or not. That's the theoretical structure. So the data, I will use the internal database from the Department of Prison Administration. It's about 100,000 convicts released from 200 prisons in Italy between 2009 and 2012. That's about 25,000 per year. I will look at only men only. That's nearly 95% of convicts in Italy, they're men. Only those with complete work records, again, 95% of males. And because the theory, in fact, speaks about property crime only, I will restrict my analysis to property crimes. I mean, with people that have been convicted with some for some property crime. That's 88%. So sample statistics very quickly, 60% are Italian. These are the three largest foreign minorities in Italian prisons. Age distribution looks like what we know. It's concentrated between 25 and 38. Some demographic characteristics, education, so very low educational attainment, as you can imagine. Statistics on when they enter in prison, geographic distribution, prison terms. So it's they stay in prison on an average of almost 2 years in my sample, so between 6 months and 6 years. These are the reincarceration statistics. That's pretty important. So this is basically the reincarceration rate. 18% are incarcerated within 1 year, 27% 2 years, 30% after within 3 years of release. And this is the distribution of conviction offenses. In order of importance, most of these people are incarcerated for drug dealing, then there is theft of some kind, robbery, assault, and so on. And this is how much they work. So 50% of them work, and the average number of hours work is 200 per year. That's the additional one standard deviation of 240 that would generate the effect that I'm going to describe in a minute. And that's average hourly wage, and that's how much, these are all euros, monetary values. These are the total earnings. So some people make pretty good money in prison, like 33,000 euros. That's the maximum. Okay, I think my time is over, so I'll jump right away to the results. So this is the overall effect. So it's what I mentioned at the beginning. This number means that if you increase by 240 hours, the annual number of hours that they work during the incarceration term, the reduced form estimates tell you that after 1 year, the reincarceration rate is reduced by 10 percentage points. After 3 years, it's 15 percentage points. These are precisely estimated. As you see, these are the standard errors in parentheses. Now, the structural estimates, which technically are done through, essentially the model produces a probability of reincarceration that is a function of the parameters that control these three mechanisms, and I use a minimum distance estimator, GMM, to identify them. The idea is to have the theory and the data intuitively to be as close as possible. So when doing this and then simulating the theoretical model replicates extremely well the recidivism rate, the drop in the reincarceration rate after 1 year. That's the only thing I can estimate within the model, only the 1 year effect. So the reduced form estimates say 10.4%, the model says 10.9, so very close. The model fits the data very well. So by fitting the data very well, I can then provide the structural decomposition of these 10.9 percentage points. You see that 3.7% is the contribution of the liquidity channel. The bulk, 7.1 percentage points, is through the training channel, the human capital. And this reduction of criminal capital is essentially negligible. And I'm actually done. I'll just do the back on the envelope calculation. So if you put together the short-term annual cost per inmate, which in Italy is 8,000 euros, and you consider the average prison term in the sample and the 3 years effect, 15 percentage points, that comes at this cost of 240 hours per year. So that's the total cost, that's the total benefit. So the ratio, the 2 minus 1, 42% short-term return. In the long term will be even higher because you can also reduce the fixed cost of the criminal justice system, like you would be able to do with less police, smaller prison, less congested courts, and so on. But even in the short run, you get this 40% reduction, which is pretty high. Okay, that's all. That's, again, my conclusions, which I have illustrated already, and I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Giulio. That was really interesting. So, questions? Here we go, right at the front. And has someone, there's Jessie with the microphone. So I should have picked someone closer towards
Oh, thank you. Thank you, that was very interesting. I'm just wondering, with the 30% participation rate in employment and with people able to earn as much as 33,000 euros, is there any stand-up, do you know if there's much of a problem with the haves and the have-nots standing over each other and trying to get money out of other extortion, basically? Does that go on a lot in the Italian prisons?
Inside prisons?
Yeah.
So you cannot do any extortion because actually, I skipped on that, but the money is not actually paid to you. The money is put into an account. You cannot withdraw money from the account. You cannot withdraw cash before you are released. So the only thing you can do is to send the money home or place some orders for goods that will be delivered to you but paid out of the account. So no, there's no cash in Italian prisons.
But for the goods that you can buy with...
Oh, yeah. Yes, I see what you mean. It could be, yes. I don't know, but I would not surprised if there was some kind of extortion mechanism like that. Could be, yes. It is a plausible thing to
We don't pay so handsomely in our prisons.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions? There's Jack, yeah.
Do you think you have to pay that much? Do you think you can pay our, measly $1.20? Or do you think you'll get less effect? Obviously you do, because if you've got... What do you think?
Yeah, so given that this liquidity channel seems to be relevant, so suppose you pay them zero. Go back to that table. If you pay them zero, you would basically shut down, you would drive that liquidity contribution to zero, according to these estimates. Right? So if you don't pay them, it would basically reduce the effectiveness of prison work. Now, we may discuss how much, whether it's worth paying them. So how much is that 3.7% worth? So we can, again, engage in the same kind of back-on-the-envelope calculation. I haven't done it, but actually it's a good idea to do it. I don't know. So, but yeah, the point is, if you don't pay them, you will shut that down. So is it a good idea to pay them or not? I don't know. So the reason why they're paid so much in Italy, effectively, is for political reasons. So this prison code was written in the 1970s when there was a strong labor movement and so on. And so all of the principles regulating the legal labor, the actual free world labor market should have also regulated the prison labor market. So it was therefore political reasons. There is some debate. Some people are saying because not all of them can work, what if we drive that to zero so we don't pay them? So all of them can work, and then we will boost this training effect. So yes, that's a reasonable thing to suggest.
But we don't really know whether it wouldn't be true that if you halved the salary, you've halved the liquidity. We don't know the relationship there, do we?
Yeah.
It's only $5 an hour, so it's not like they're getting...
Yeah, well, the 30,000, well, that was the one person. That's gonna.
From 1971 or something.
That's a lot.
All right. Don, yeah.
Yeah, the average is much lower.
So I was just wondering whether there's any relationship between the size of the savings pool for an offender at the time of release and the likelihood of return to prison.
The relation between what?
So some prisoners will have saved more money than others. So by the time of release, some will have a substantial pool of savings that they...
What do you mean some prisons would have saved more money?
Well, they will all be spending different amounts of time in prison.
Yeah.
So if they are working, they will accumulate different amounts of money.
The prisoners.
The prisoners. So I was just wondering if those who have accumulated a lot of money are less likely to come back than those who've only accumulated a small amount.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that. That's a good question. So yeah, we'll be looking for basically, yeah, and not just. So let me see. So actually, I think the answer to that is, so these estimates are for, over here. These estimates are for 240 hours. So this is basically is a linear effect. So the more you, because the salary is the same for everyone,
Yeah.
essentially 1 extra hour means that you work more and you earn more money.
Right.
So I think the answer is there already, and is if you, so that's an average effect, that's 10 percentage points. If you work more hours, of course, the effect for you individually would be higher.
Right. The reason I ask is that probably about 30 or 40 years ago, there was an experiment in the US called the TARP experiment, where they
Yeah.
actually gave prisoners, you know this study, they actually gave prisoners cash
Yes.
on release and didn't find an effect on recidivism. So,
Yeah, there's been a more recent experiment in Uruguay. Literally was giving cash to convicts upon release, and they did find a strong effect on first-day recidivism. Like people getting back to prison the very same day, which apparently is a very relevant phenomenon. Maybe you know about it. So I don't know which outcomes these people in the US have looked at, but this paper was published in Journal of Public Economics a few years ago. The result was that giving small amount of money, something like $50 in their pockets, the day that they are released, maybe in Australia you should give them more because everything is so terribly expensive from a European perspective. You give them $200, say, then first day recidivism, according to their results, may drop significantly.
okay, thank you.
So that small amount of money helps people getting back on track.
One other completely unrelated question is there any political criticism in Italy for paying prisoners such generous sums of money?
Yes.
It would be a disaster here if you... No, it'd be great, but it'd be a disaster public relations-wise.
Yeah. The most recurrent argument is we have all these people in prison that we don't have enough money to let all of them work.
Right.
Only 1 in 3 works. We have to do this job rotation and so on. Why don't we have them working for free?
Right.
So that everybody works. But the strong resistance to that, because of the historical, cultural tradition in Italy, there's a strong resistance, political resistance in having convicts work for free. Yeah.
All right, I think we've run out of time. That was a great presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for great questions.